So, welcome to this class on motor units. This is part 2 of few parts, about 3-4 parts as part of the Neuroscience of Human Movement course. So, what we saw yesterday was motor units, its types and their properties. So, in today's class we will talk about, we will review what we saw in the previous class first, and then we will talk about how these motor units are distributed in terms of forces and times to peak, etc., and what role, if any, does physical activity or inactivity have in the properties of motor units, and some principles based on which motor units are recruited, size principle and rate coding. So, it is a relatively deep concepts, these two. Okay. So, what we saw yesterday was that motor units are divided into a few types, those that are slow and less fatigable, those that are fast and more fatigable, those that are with intermediate speed of contraction and have intermediate fatigability. This is what we saw yesterday. So, we divided this into a few types and we said these are oxidative and glycolytic or purely glycolytic. A question is how to distinguish the fiber types, how we have distinguished fiber types. I have already said this is type 1, type 2, etc. How are these distinguished? How is this done? There are a few methods. One popular method is this histochemical assays of myosin adenosine triphosphatase or myosin ATPase. Histochemical assays will show different responses for the different types of fibers. So, that is one. The other types not discussed in this class are genetic methods. Okay. So, what has been found is that most motor units produce relatively low forces and most motor units have intermediate contraction times. What you will see is that, suppose I were to draw a response between a function of say torque in millinewton meter and the percentage of motor units recruited, right. Suppose what relatively small amounts of torque is produced by relatively large sets of motor units, it is about 25%. 25% of the total number of motor units produce small amount of torque, and about a little less than 25 produce a slightly larger amount of torque, and so on and so forth, right. So, then say if this is 10, for example, there is going to be one that is like this, and this reduces after some time, and that means there is a very small amount of there is a very small number of motor units that produce very large amount of force. Most motor units produce low forces, and then suppose I was to have a similar curve for contraction times. Okay. Suppose I am having contraction time is basically the time taken to reach the peak, is it not? We saw if I have a similar plot for time to peak with what number of motor units will have, you will see that there are some smaller number of motor units with small times to peak, then that increases and so on and so forth. This is approximately a normal curve. So, if I were to plot this, I am going to get something like that. So, what you get again is that, and most motor units are located here and they have intermediate contraction times. So, most motor units have low forces, most motor units produce low forces and they have intermediate contraction times. So, these are two important lessons that we need to learn in terms of motor unit properties and their distribution, how motor units are distributed in terms of their properties. If I had 100 motor units, a large number of these 100 are going to produce low forces and a large number of these 100 are going to have intermediate contraction times. Okay. So, this is the general truth. spread across muscles. This is going to vary between individuals, this is going to vary between muscles, this is going to vary between groups of individuals and so on and so forth. I am talking about the general case. Then what else? Suppose if this was the case, can I influence this somehow? The answer is yes. I am interested in changing the following properties. We said these are the 3 important properties of motor units: speed of contraction. What is desirable in this case? A higher speed of contraction is desirable. I want to control these things quickly. A higher speed, more is good. Maximum force, again what is desirable? A higher force is desirable in general. In general, a higher force is desirable. Again, more is good. Fatigability. In fatigability, I want to have least fatigue while I am doing tasks. So here more is not good, whereas less fatigability is good. One method, and we saw these are the types and we discussed this, so there is it changes between oxidative and glycolytic and glycolytic. One method to change this is physical activity or exercise. So what would one expect? As one would expect, power exercises, those that involve high intensity, this would be weightlifting or what are called as high intensity interval training or HIIT. High intensity interval training or weightlifting increases the speed of contraction and maximal force. So, I am interested, as I said, what are my interests? My interest is in increasing the speed of contraction and in increasing the maximum force that can be produced. That is possible. I can achieve both by doing power exercises, by doing weightlifting or by doing what are called as high intensity interval exercises. Either way, the intensity has to be very high, that is the point. If I need to reduce fatigability, I said fatigability is desirable if it is less fatigability is desirable, right. If I want to reduce fatigability, I need to perform prolonged low intensity exercises. So, it is known that if I perform prolonged but low intensity exercises for a relatively long periods of time, this is going to engage the aerobic portion of the spectrum that we saw. This is the spectrum that we saw. I am interested in reducing fatigue, I am interested in training this part, is it not? I am interested in doing the aerobic exercises more. If I am doing weightlifting, this is glycolytic, anaerobic. I am interested in engaging the aerobic portion more for a relatively long period, this will reduce fatigability. How? How does this do that? That is the question. How? Is that some sort of magic that does this? The answer is no, there is a reason why. There are physiological reasons why this happens. We said contraction speed increases with weightlifting. Why? What is the process that causes this? What is the mechanism? What is the physiological mechanism that causes this? This actually happens due to changes in the properties of myosin molecules, thus changing the maximum velocity. So, the myosin molecules have an enhanced response, causing a change in the maximum velocity, thus causing an increase or a desirable increase in the contraction speed. Of course, this is not going to keep on increasing forever until some level. And how is maximal force increased? Well, due to enlargement of the fiber. So, the fiber itself becomes bigger and that causes or concomitantly, simultaneously there is an increase in the force producing capability of these fibers. So, the fibers become bigger as in bulkier and also become stronger in terms of its ability to produce more force, causing an increase in the maximal force that can be produced. Fatigability reduction is actually not so simple. It is accompanied by changes in several levels of control. These can be capillaries, changes in the properties of the capillaries, because we said this is an oxidative process, more oxygen is needed, right. So, changes in the capillaries properties and changes in the distribution of mitochondria, etc. And a combination of several other things causes reduction in fatigability. Usually these two are easier to achieve, relatively easier to achieve when comparison with this. This is hard. With everything requires practice. This is hard. Why? Because usually these two involve changes in type 2 fibers, is it not? This one involves changes in type 1 fibers. Usually type 1 fibers are less adaptive or more difficult to change in their properties. We see that there are individuals who are difficult to change or who find it difficult to change themselves, and then there are individuals who find it easier to change themselves. Likewise, these guys are relatively more adaptable in comparison with type 1. So, a question is, does it always help? Does it help if you are older? Physical activity, it turns out that adaptive properties of fibers decline with age. So, the response is going to be greatest when you are young. So, exercise has the greatest benefit when you are young. As you get older, the response of the fibers, the response of the physiological response of the body is going to decline when you get older. Yet it turns out that muscles are still adaptive, still dynamic, that even a person above 80 years, even 90 years can still see some improvement, relatively smaller improvement this in comparison. So, exercise has the greatest benefit when you are young, and the benefit reduces as a function of age. So, as you become older, the benefit reduces, but there is still some residual benefit. You still get some benefit of exercise even after 80 years, even after even in cases of 90 years and so on. Even at 90 years, muscle tissues and these properties, the fiber properties, change even at 90 years of age, which is surprising. What would you expect at that age? So exercise is good, but it is less beneficial when you are older. Okay. And we said, does the composition of fibers change? I told you already, type 2A, 2B, etc., their properties change, whereas type 1 properties also changes, but not so easily. What could cause a change in the type 1 properties? Well, substantial interventions such as space flight. In space flight, what happens is that there is no gravity, or there is a microgravity that causes the person to lose muscle mass. So, there is a reduction in muscle mass, there is a reduction in muscle mass, fiber mass in all the 3 types of fibers. Even type 1 fibers are reduced to some extent. Of course, so how would you increase this? Prolonged stimulation at relatively low frequencies for a relatively long period of time can bring back the lost muscle mass after some time. So, which is why astronauts after they return back, say from a space station, right, cannot immediately walk. They will take some time to adapt to this world, they will take some time. So, they are brought back, there is a rehab program for them, and then they get to merge with the rest of the society. The other case is the case of surgical implantation. Suppose we do a surgery where a muscle nerve that is innervating a relatively fast muscle is attached to a relatively slow muscle. So, this happens from time to time. There are situations when this is required to be done. In such cases, a nerve is transplanted from a fast muscle to a slow muscle. In that case, what happens? This slow muscle adapts itself and tries and behaves more like the fast muscle. So, these two are obviously substantial interventions, right. So, these two involve space flight is a relatively rare phenomenon, not everybody goes through that, and surgery is also relatively rare. Surgery, moving the nerve transplant, right, moving the nerve from one muscle to another muscle is also a relatively rare phenomenon. So, these are substantial interventions that could cause a change in type 1 properties and so on and so forth. Okay. What happens, how are these units recruited? It turns out that recruitment itself happens in the order of weakest to the strongest, that produces smallest amount of force in a muscle is the weakest. The motor unit that produces the largest amount of force is the strongest. So, suppose I order this in the order of their strength or in the order of their ability to produce maximal force, then recruitment happens in an orderly fashion from the weakest to the strongest. First, the weakest motor units are recruited, and then the next stronger one is recruited, and then the next stronger one is recruited, and so on and so forth. This also means that the recruitment proceeds from slow to fast, or from, I have put them in brackets because this is not exactly or always true, but this is mostly true, or from small to large. So, motor units are recruited in the size, in the order of their size. We said what is motor unit size? Motor unit size is defined by the innervation number, is it not? The number of muscle fibers innervated by a motor neuron. If it is small, then that is a small motor unit. The number that is, if it is large, if the motor innervation number is large, we call it as a large motor unit. Actually, quite literally, the motor neuron size also correlates very well with the motor unit size. In other words, the large motor units usually are innervated by large motor neurons. These motor neurons have larger diameters, they are literally big. A question is, we said that this recruitment happens in the order of size from the smallest to the largest. This principle is called as size principle, or also called as Henneman's principle, proposed by Elwood Henneman in the 1950s. Why is this true? Why should this happen this way? Why not, suppose I want to produce, say, a given Newton of force, why not directly recruit the motor unit that produces that amount of force and leaving all the others out? Why do I have to do this? Why does this principle hold true? That is one. How, what is the mechanism that causes this to be true? These are the two questions that are there with us. We will answer them. First, let us take a look at this, as in this part of the picture, right. Suppose spinal interneuron sends a particular amount of synaptic current. We am going to call the synaptic current as IS. Okay. IS amount of current, synaptic current, is sent in a motor neuronal pool. Motor neuronal pool means there are several motor neuron cell bodies lying in this area of the spinal cord, right. So, these are located in the ventral ganglion, is it not, ventral root ganglion. So, several of these neurons are present in the motor neuronal pool. They come in multiple sizes, there are multiple sizes. Let us take two extreme cases, one that is relatively small, we are going to call this as small, and one that is relatively large, it is already there. So, this is large and this is small, and also note the small motor neuron is innervating 3 fibers, and the large motor neuron is innervating a relatively larger number of fibers, say 5 to 10, say for example. Assuming that all the muscle fibers produce equal amount of force, this one will produce smaller amount of force and that one will produce a larger amount of force, is it not. So, suppose the same current is sent to both of this, a question is which one will achieve threshold first, that is the question. I am sending the same synaptic current, which one of these two will achieve depolarization or will achieve threshold first. It turns out that a principle similar to Ohm's law holds true in this case. So, the voltage or the membrane potential is a product of the current, which is the synaptic current, and the surface resistance and the resistance, and we know that the resistance itself is inversely proportional to area. What happens is that a given synaptic current first depolarizes the smallest motor neuron and then depolarizes the next larger motor neuron and then depolarizes the next larger motor neuron and so on and so forth, thus creating an orderly recruitment of motor neurons. And it turns out that the smaller motor neurons innervate a smaller number of fibers, the larger motor neurons innervate a larger number of fibers. That means this motor neuron is going to produce a smaller amount of force. So, a given synaptic current depending on its, so that obviously this changes as a function of the synaptic current without doubt. So, a given synaptic current may recruit this and some more motor neurons, but not the larger ones, and so on and so forth. So, that means that I can change the order of recruitment by depending on the size. This is due to this property of the motor neurons. Because of the distribution of the sizes, the resistance distribution varies. Because of the change in the distribution of the resistances, the smaller motor neurons reach threshold earlier, or smaller motor neurons reach threshold with smaller currents in comparison with the larger motor neurons, which require relatively larger currents to reach their own threshold. Action potential will be produced only when they reach threshold. When they reach threshold, then action potential is produced in these motor neurons, producing an action potential in these fibers and causing excitation, contraction, coupling and force and so on and so forth, right. So, is that the only mechanism in which I can change force? That is the question. Can I just are there other things that come into the picture? It turns out that there are other things. So, but before we talk about the other things, this principle where there is an orderly recruitment of motor neurons in the order of increasing size from smaller to the motor is called, smaller to the larger is called as size principle or Henneman's principle. It turns out that this is not the only mechanism by which this can happen, there are other mechanisms. Let us consider a case where I have to produce a particular amount of force, say that force, that amount of force, the one that is indicated in the blue line, that is the amount of force that I have to produce. So, this there are, please note there are two y axis, y1 axis and the y2 axis. Y1 axis the plot is in blue, this is the blue plot and that is the red plot, okay, just so you know to read this properly. So, you see I want to produce this force, I want to produce that force, right, the one that is shown by the blue plot. The one that is shown by the blue plot is what I want to produce, and let us say I have recorded activity discharge rates of some motor units. Actually there are multiple motor units that are recruited to produce this force. Let us say that I have measured the activity of 4 different motor units. These motor units I am going to call that as the motor neurons, I am going to call this as M1, M2, M3, M4. What is the method in which you could measure their activity? We will have to see how to measure their activity. I am saying I have measured the activity of these motor units. How? We have not discussed that so far, we will discuss it in future class. So, somehow for the purpose of this class, let us assume that this has somehow been recorded. I have somehow been able to measure the activity of these motor units individually. Okay. The first motor unit is recruited at that time when the value at a frequency of about 10 hertz. I keep increasing this value, right, and that causes an increase in force, and I recruit one more motor unit and I keep increasing the discharge rate. So, for the red we will have to see the right hand side scale, y2 scale, is it not. So, the discharge rate keeps increasing for these two motor units. As these two motor units discharge rates keeps increasing, the force seems to increase. This is the output, blue line is the output, which is the force, red lines are the input for the case considered, right. So, as the red lines keep increasing, the blue line also keeps increasing, right. Then at some point I am recruiting a new motor unit. As I recruit this motor unit and change its discharge activity, change its firing rate, it causes a further increase in force. Then a particular point in force is reached where this guy is going to be recruited, and its firing rate also keeps increasing, and at some point a maximum force is reached, and then I keep reducing, and there, and also note the guy who was recruited last, the motor unit who was recruited last is relieved first. Fourth motor unit is first relieved, then 3, then 2, then 1. Recruitment happens in the order of increasing size, there is de-recruitment. happens in the order of decreasing size. So, the largest motor unit is functional for a brief amount of time. So, this is a smaller amount of time, the x axis is time here. So, this fourth motor unit is active only for a brief amount of time, whereas 1 is active for a larger amount of time. So, from this conversation, what are we able to say? We will be able to say that 1 is a smaller motor unit, 2 is relatively larger, 3 is relatively larger, and 4 is the largest in these 4 motor units at least under consideration. And as I keep increasing the discharge rate, as this increases, it seems that the force is increasing. That means the following, that means I can increase the force either by recruiting the stronger motor unit, which is the fourth in this case, or by increasing the discharge rate. If I increase the discharge rate or the firing rate of a motor neuron, then the force is going to increase. So, there is not just one way that we have seen is size principle. The other way in which I can increase the force is by increasing the rate of firing of the motor neurons. Okay. So, I can keep increasing the rate of firing of the motor neuron and increase the force. So, there are two ways in which this can happen. One is size principle, 2 is rate coding or rate of firing of motor neurons. What are the important consequences of size principle? What causes, what are the most important consequences? First and foremost, motor unit recruitment is controlled by spinal mechanisms, spinal processes, not brain related processes. The brain cannot choose, excuse me, please recruit motor unit number 1345 or whatever. It cannot say that. It can only specify something else. It can only specify a synaptic current. It can only specify a particular amount of activity. It cannot choose which particular motor unit to be recruited. Suppose I have 2 motor units, right? Suppose I have 2 motor units of equal size, of equal force producing capability. For example, which one of the 2 will get recruited is a question. When the threshold is reached, for that to be this, both of them will reach threshold simultaneously, right? But if both of them are recruited, it is possible that the force will be overshooted, which is undesirable. So, at a particular point in time, only one of them is recruited, the others are not recruited. How is this happening? Not through brain processes, through spinal control mechanisms. So, brain is not the only controller in this case. The spinal cord plays an important, crucial role in function of in this function, especially in motor unit recruitment. In particular, brain is excluded from choosing which motor units to recruit and at what times. Brain can only say what is IS in here, right? IS is specified from somewhere in the top. So, this is the boss, or actually this boss is receiving inputs from other bosses, right? It can only specify IS. It cannot say which of the 2 to recruit. No, that is the spinal cord's role. What is not discussed, you will soon see what is not discussed. Something else is not discussed. Toward the end of the class I will talk about that. Importantly, brain does not participate in choosing which particular motor unit is to be recruited. And also, motor units are activated in the order of increasing fatigability. Why is this important? Suppose I want to produce a particular amount of force, that force, say 50 Newton of force needs to be produced. For example, I need to produce 50 Newton of force. I am having a motor unit that could produce, let's take a simpler example. Let's say I want to produce 10 Newton of force, for example, and I am having say 2 or 3 motor units together that can produce 10 Newtons. I am going to call these as unit 1 plus unit 2 plus unit 3 equal to 10 Newtons can be produced. These are relatively large motor units, each of them can produce approximately several Newtons, several units of Newtons. Or I am having small u's, this is mu actually, u1, or let us call this as ux, ui or ux1, ux, and several small of u4, u5, lots of this until un, a very large number of small motor units are there. Which one will be chosen? That is the question. It turns out that this one will be chosen against this one will not be chosen. If there are a smaller number of motor units producing the same force in comparison with a larger number of motor units, suppose 10 Newton force is produced by 100 motor units, the same 10 Newton force is produced by a combination of 3 motor units, right, the chances are that the 100 motor units are going to be recruited. Why? Because these are smaller motor units, that means they are also slower and less fatigable. So, to produce the 10 Newton force, I am going to have the least amount of fatigability, whereas to produce, if I use these guys, they are larger motor units that are more fatigable. So, I will still be able to produce 10 Newtons. You might ask like, well, your aim is to produce 10 Newtons, what does it matter whether it comes from 3 motor units or from 100 motor units? It does not matter. However, I am not just interested in producing 10 Newton force, I am also interested in not getting fatigued. That is not an explicit control variable, you are not stating that as the part of the task, but not just humans, all organisms are interested in not becoming fatigued. So, I am not interested in becoming tired or becoming fatigued. So, the chances are I am going to recruit this, not just the chances, this is 100% chance. I am going to almost always recruit a large number of motor units to achieve a particular amount of force. This is again a consequence of size principle. Motor units are activated in the order of increasing fatigability. So, I am first recruiting smaller ones and then the larger ones. Smaller ones are having less fatigability. So, by default I am using a strategy that is going to reduce the probability that I am going to be fatigued. However, if I have to produce a very large amount of force, right, more than say more than 70% of my maximum, more than 80% of my maximum, let us say that I can lift 100 kgs for the sake of discussion, let us say that I can lift 100 kgs, I am asked to lift 85 kgs, right. It is impossible that I can achieve 85 kgs just with the small motor units, I will still have to recruit the larger motor units. At that time, what are the odds that I am going to become fatigued? Very high. Why? I have already recruited the larger motor units. So, then the question comes, why then have these motor units, larger motor units? If you are going to use them less in general, they are going, that means these larger motor units are going to be used only when there is an absolute need to produce that large amount of force. So, you have a very simple principle that is followed, the body has this principle, either you use it or you lose it. So, if you are not using it, it turns out that if you are continuously leading a sedentary lifestyle, if you are a person who is say leading a sedentary lifestyle, not much exercise, the chances are that your muscles are not going to be strong enough for you to suddenly lift a 50 kg bag of rice one fine day at your home. That is not going to be possible, because you have not really trained yourself to do that. It is expensive to maintain muscle mass and bone mass, it is expensive, metabolically expensive. So, the body prefers to not store the muscles or fibers that are not being utilized, not have them, they are disposed of in favor of smaller motor units, but still there are some of them that are retained, that are going to be used in terms of emergencies, in times of emergency when you need them the most. Okay. So, we said that there is these are the two important consequences of size principle. This is most important, that the brain cannot control specifically which motor unit to be fired. The brain cannot do that, it is a spinal process. Okay. Suppose I recruit all the 100%, suppose I have 100 motor neurons or 100 motor units, I have activated all 100 of them, will I reach 100% of the force? The answer is no. Why not? I have recruited, I said there are 100 motor units, all of them are active, all the 100 are active. I should be reaching 100% of my maximal ability, right? That is what one would think. The answer is no, because it turns out that I am able to increase force by another mechanism. I said that I can increase force not just by motor unit recruitment, but also by the rate of firing. I have only said that I have recruited all 100, but I have not said at what rate they are firing. It is possible that all the motor units, after they are recruited, if they are firing at relatively slow firing frequencies, then the force that may be produced after 100% recruitment, it could cause sometimes in some muscles as less as 60% force, 60% of the maximum force, sometimes 75%. Then how is the other 40% achieved? In this case, how is the other 40% achieved? In this case, how is the other 25% achieved? By increasing the firing rate of the already recruited motor neurons. I have already recruited these motor neurons, I increase their firing rates. From 60 it becomes 65. If I increase the firing rate, I increase the firing rate further, it becomes 70, 75, 85, 95, whatever, 100 at some point, right. So, it is possible for me to do that by two processes, by size principle and increasing the rate of firing. So, what happens is usually first the small motor units are recruited, so about 25%, and what is the force, maximal force that is achieved is about less than 10% of the maximal force. This is percentage of the maximum force that can be produced. Say if the maximum force is 100, so this is about less than 10 newtons is produced by 25 of the 100 motor units that are available. Suppose there are 100 motor units that are available and the force that is produced is 100 newtons for the sake of discussion, right. 25 motor units together produce less than 10 newton force. This is comparison to the case that the discussion that you see always on media, that 2% or 1% of the wealthy people have 60% of the world's wealth or something like that, right. So, there is a disproportionate distribution of wealth. Likewise, there is a disproportionate number of motor units that are recruited to produce a small amount of force, is it not? So, disproportionately large amount of motor units need to be produced. Then fatigue resistant motor units are recruited, so that causes an increase about 20% of the maximum force can be produced, and then I keep increasing, right. And then what happens, at some point I have recruited all 100 of my motor units. At what is the force at that level? Approximately 80. So, after I recruit all the 100 motor units, after all of them are recruited, I am able to produce about 80% of the force. Then how is this increase happening? This increase is happening by increasing the firing rate of the motor neurons, right. Just illustrating the important principle that firing rate, increasing the firing rate of motor neurons can and will increase the force. But note, it is not, when in these discussions it might appear to you as if I am saying that the firing rate is increased only after all the motor units are already recruited. But what actually happens is that even here, even in these regimes, right, some motor units are recruited at slow firing rates and their their firing rates are increased even in these regimes. This is a theoretical concept just to explain that after 100% motor unit recruitment I can increase the force further. For that I am using this principle, but it turns out that even at below 100% recruitment, even at 50% or 60% or 70% of the motor units are recruited, even at that range force can be increased by increasing the firing rate of the motor neurons. At all times force can be increased by increasing the firing rate of the motor neurons. That is the principle. So, to review one important principle before we summarize this and talk about the next class, an important principle. Suppose let us take two cases. So, to illustrate, to review what happened, let us draw the activity of motor unit 1 here, and I am going to draw force. Let us say that this motor unit starts firing at some frequency, okay. What happens at around that point, the motor unit starts firing, then the force that was relatively small or non-existent or close to 0 starts to increase at that point, slowly increase, not like that, okay, relatively slow increase, slowly increase like that. Then I suddenly increase the frequency, then the increase is happening at a greater slope and then sustained frequency, then the increase is happening like that. Then let us say another guy comes into the picture, let us say there is a different motor unit, I am going to call this guy as motor unit 2, okay, and that guy starts firing at around that point, okay, at a say at a sustained frequency. It is possible then what will happen is the force increases like that, say for example there is a sudden increase in force like that, and then this guy is de-recruited and then there is a decrease in force. What could you say about the properties of these two motor units? It is immediately obvious that this mu2 causes a relatively strong increase in force, that means it must be a larger motor unit, that means it must produce a larger force, that means it must be the faster motor unit, is it not? This is mu2, the response, this is time, so the x axis is time, okay. So, suppose I were to draw the responses of these two motor units, I am going to draw the response of the mu1, okay, time in milliseconds not seconds, for example the response of the motor unit 1, right. This is a slow motor unit that increases that reaches peak and then dies down like that, for example, right. The order of force, the scale of, so the y axis here is force, say the absolute force is in units of millinewtons for mu1. For the motor unit 2 though, suppose I were drawing the same force versus time curve, right, I am going to have something like that, with the scale being different, this will be in the order of several tens of millinewtons. So, that means if I recruit mu2, if I recruit the motor unit 2, I am going to see this sudden development, this increase in slope. Why? Because this guy can produce a greater amount of force. Note the difference in scales, this is in units of motor, this is in units of millinewtons, this is in several tens of millinewtons. So, from this we can also, what is known is that, suppose what is also known is the following, suppose threshold in millinewtons is on the x axis and force, twitch force that is produced is on the y axis. What you see is that there is relatively linear response. So, as the threshold increases, the twitch force produced also increases, relatively linear response is also found. So, this means that I could recruit depending on the situation, these choices are made by the central nervous system, by the spinal cord. So, what are the two principles that control this? Size principle and rate coding. And we also saw we reviewed motor units, we reviewed how the motor unit properties are distributed across this, and we discussed the critical role of physical activity in day to day functioning. The joker in the pack is what is called as persistent inward currents and EMG. This is in the next class. Persistent inward current I am calling as the joker in the pack because this changes everything. So, we have so far seen, I have now said, I have now described the system as if it is an engineering system. I am giving a greater current, a bigger motor unit is recruited, a greater force is produced. That seems too simple for the biological system. For the biological system, it seems like I am giving, so this is like changing a response with a greater amplitude of the input, something that we would do in electrical engineering, something that we would do in engineering systems. I am keeping, I am increasing some input, the output is also increasing as you would expect. That is what I have now described, and also I am increasing the frequency of firing, the force is increasing. So far so good, but what is not discussed is this important role of monoaminergic input from elsewhere in the system. So, this is the joker in the pack, persistent invert currents. We need to discuss its critical, crucial role in adjusting the sensitivity or gain of the motor neuronal pool or excitability of the motor neuronal pool tomorrow in future classes, and we will also discuss EMG. So, with this we come to the end of today's class. Thank you very much.